Hi, I'm Jay from Real Street. Today I'm here with Pablo. This is my small block Ford out of my Mustang. These engines are nothing new to me. I've been working on these engines for nearly 30 years. However, it is Pablo's first go at a old school push rod engine, so hopefully he's got some neat questions to ask.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to see the differences. Like Jay said, this is my first one of these types of engines. I'm more of a Honda type of guy, and it's interesting to see the contrast, so I'm pretty excited to take a look at it.
So this engine is a bit different than the engines that we're used to, modern stuff. This is, an old school push rod based V8. So you have a cam tunnel. So while the crankshaft is out, we're gonna go ahead and put the camshaft in the block. That way we can be careful to manage its weight and not beat up the soft cam bearings. So it's a coated bearing. It should do well with the additional valve spring pressure that's gonna be persistently pushing down on the camshaft. But we still want to be careful as we feed the camshaft into the block.
You mentioned the cam bearings. Is that an easily serviceable item, or does the full engine need to be apart as it is?
It's a job best done with a bare block.
Right.
Because there's some fitting to the cam bearings. They don't just, nothing about this engine just happens to go together.
Okay.
These engines are arguably much more intense. Quite a bit of a labor of love compared to a modern engine that just gives up a lot of power easily.
Right.
The factory blocks on these cars weren't very strong, and much over 500 or so horsepower, you get into kind of a casting problem where the blocks would actually split down the mains.
Wow.
And so you'd be making passes and you'd go to get your time slip and the oil pressure gauge would be at 0. And you'd give it some throttle and the oil pressure gauge would come back up. And there were splits right down here, would actually break right in the mains. So this block is a Dart-based, Dart machinery. They're one of the long-running foundries in America that has been supporting the aftermarket for quite some time. And they have this, they call it a man of war block. And this block is 4-bolt main caps. It's Siamese bore. It's 166 pounds, just the block. It's very heavy duty. So if you're trying to make 1,000 or 1,200 horsepower or more with a small block Ford-based engine, this would be the thing that you'd reach for.
So the automatic, you don't want to crack your block. You want to make some power that's reliable. Just reach for it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and this brand, you may not be familiar with Dart. They did a little bit of B-series stuff back in the day.
Yeah.
Domestic guys have heavily relied on Dart as the resource for heavy-duty engine blocks. So if you had a Chevy or a Ford, you'd reach for a Dart block. Because
I've heard the name a lot, just like you said, in the domestic world. But I think they're also working on that Jay-Z project, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's a much anticipated thing. If those guys can get that project off the ground and sorted with the right development partners and have a really neat foundry to push through a killer end product, I think the industry will be much better off.
It's interesting for sure.
As the castings dry up, you don't have a choice. You need blocks.
Right. What kind of displacement do you get out of this?
Well, it's 381 cubic inches.
What's that work out to?
381 cubic inches.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's real good.
Yep. It's 6.2 liters.
Wow.
It's a big engine.
Yeah.
Yeah, the bores are like 4,130.
Holy crap.
And the crankshaft is just over 3.5 inches. In native form, this engine was as small as 289.
Oh wow, it's a decent amount of difference.
And when it came, if you had a 90s Mustang, you would have had 302 cubic inches. So it is quite a bit bigger than the factory engine.
Is that just mainly bore and stroke?
Yeah. You can't add cylinders. Pablo.
You're already using 8 of them. No, I mean, I don't know if it was... no, serious question, because I don't know if it was a tall deck situation that you could add an extreme amount of stroke or something like that.
No, this is a short engine, and that's a great point to make, because one of the thoughts behind an engine like this is because it's a short deck engine, 8.2 inches. The NASCAR engines were 9. and then the truck engines were 9.5 inch.
Wow.
So you can get a pretty big small block Ford.
Right.
But as the deck gets taller, the argument is the push rods get longer, and then there's more deflection present, and valve train gets harder to sort. And a lot of people have made tall deck engines work. But I have this, and this is what I'm doing, and I'm not really interested in another one of these. This is it for me. This is the one I'll have.
Last one.
This is the last one.
Well, when you see the stuff that like people like Brett are doing with the Coyote platform,
Yeah.
and if you're chasing a V8, I mean, you can't really beat that.
No, because it has good airflow. These engines
Right.
were not powerful stock. If you dynoed my car when it was new, it would have made 190, 195 horsepower. And it is like dead by like 5,400 RPM. It's terrible.
Insert like a B18C Type R, 200 horsepower.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean,
It's crazy.
They
Technology.
technology, airflow. You know, it's,
Right.
it's an airflow game. That's where you end up. You end up your displacement and airflow is the NA game.
Is this also a 180-degree thrust?
Yeah. Yep, and they weren't without problems. You know, back in the old days, torque converters weren't that good, and you had a lot of torque converter problems. There were guys that would drill through the main into the thrust to bleed oil out onto the thrust to try and compensate for the load that the torque converter was applying. There were clutch cars that they would move to a roller bearing thrust, like a Torrington bearing system on the thrust bearing. So there was more than one way to kind of skin the cat when it came to thrust bearings. But this engine with a stick shift and a reasonable clutch, it won't have problems like this. It'll be fine.
Nice.
Yeah.
Are the stock mains also 4-bolt?
No, 2-bolt. As far back as 1969, there was a Ford Boss block, which would have been a factory 4-bolt main block. And then sometime in the 80s or 90s, Ford Racing let a block out into the market called the A4. And it was a improved block by a long shot, but it wasn't like this. This block is arguably overkill for what I'm gonna do with it, but there just isn't a lot of options in the middle. You know, you're not going to get to pick and choose and say like, well, if I could find an A4 block, I could lose some nose weight. But these parts are all old parts. This block you can buy new, but those older blocks, they're just, that stuff's all drying up.
Yeah.
It's a different time, other than in the future.
One thing that I'm noticing on here that we actually touched on a couple of videos ago is the abradable coating on it.
Yep. So this stuff is a bunch of used stuff, and I had gotten a buddy of mine, just kind of like sent him all the parts and had him put the engine together because you're married with kids, you got a job, like when do you have time to work on your own stuff? So I just thought like, oh, I'll just get it done. It just didn't work out. The engine was pumping a lot of oil to the top of the engine.
Okay.
The cylinder head drain backs weren't proper, and the oil was getting trapped in the top of the engine.
Is that a big problem with these engines?
No, it's not. It was a combination of things wrong all at once. So it had the first and worst offense was the cylinder heads had screens in the oil returns, and whoever had put those screens in, not the same guy that put it together because the stuff's been passed around.
Right.
But whoever put the screens in had epoxied them in, and the epoxy job was kind of sloppy.
Oh.
And then the cylinder heads don't have the same amount of drain back that the factory cylinder heads had. So then that was another strike against me. And then the oil pump was a high volume pump, and the lifter bore clearance was pretty loose. So it had internal bleeding. It had oil being pumped up to the top. Like if you set the idle at like 1700 RPM, about a minute later, it would run out of oil pressure because all the oil would get stuck in the top of the engine.
Holy crap.
And then it would smoke. Well, at some point in these cylinder heads' life, there'd been some guides installed that were like a split pin liner, and then the valve seals were like not right. So it was a mess.
There's a lot of stuff that needed to be touched.
Yeah, and I really was disappointed, and I kind of like pushed this thing to the side for a couple of years because you know, my daughter had been born, and I was having fun learning to be a dad, and this thing just became kind of like old news bears.
Right. Well, life happens.
Yeah. So in the past couple years, I've started to make another run at it, and this is looking much better. I had a guy here in Orlando. His name is Scott Newberry, and Scott Newberry has a company. I walked into Scott Newberry's place when I was 16 years old.
Wow.
And he has taught me a lot of stuff about engines. I know it's a long time ago, Pablo. Thanks, baby. Scott has taught me a lot of stuff over the years. He's a really unique man that has so much knowledge when it comes to engines that if you can develop a rapport with him and he thinks you'll listen, he will talk. And I wouldn't know a lot of the stuff that I know today without his mentorship.
Wow.
So it's pretty cool. He's a neat guy. He's taught me a lot of stuff. And I kind of, you know, he's older now, and I went down there and just said, hey man, can you help me? Cause like, it's not going good. But he said, yeah, I'll help you, you know, and he got it straightened out. So I'm in a pretty good spot now.
It's good.
Yeah, it's going to be a good engine. We had the guys from Total Seal over the other day, and they've got some new machines on measuring bore finish and a camera, and we looked over it, and his name's Lake Speed Jr. He kind of laughed about it. He said, I know these guys, because like those guys that were cut from that cloth that did engine machine work well into their 60s, they have a certain kind of signature approach to things. And it works, you know, so we got a lot of the tasks that needed to be done to the engine got done. And like dumb things like the cylinder head drain, if you look how this is rolled back.
Right.
That cylinder head is one manufacturer. This block is another manufacturer. The cylinder head drain didn't line up right. So it's like a bunch of collective things that
Just needs to be sorted.
Well, yeah, just
right?
it needed to be sorted. It needed probably another 20 hours the first time it was built to be right. And it goes back to the buy once, cry once thing. So even someone like myself that has done this a bunch of times, and even the guy that was helping do it, you know, I just didn't get it at a good time. And I'm not gonna be salty about it or kick rocks. It happened the way it happened, and now it's just gonna get it fixed. But back to the abradable coating, it looks like it traps a lot of oil. This is an angry little engine with its short deck, big stroke, big bore, a lot of rod angle. So having that lubrication present is gonna help the engine live longer, seal up better, help it make more power. So the coating is really kind of a spongy effort. And as we saw in that video, it'll take shape as it needs to.
It's really neat stuff when you look at it under the microscope.
It's cool. I'm excited to use that coating on other things moving forward.
Yeah.
And have some fun with it. So yeah, it's good. It's good stuff.
That's cool.
Yep.
Now, a little bit ago, I pulled out a little Honda B-Series piston. For you guys watching at home, if you don't know what this is just an 81 millimeter bore. So the contrast from this to one of these pistons is pretty huge. We're talking about sub 100 to just over 100. It's about 105 millimeters for one of Jay's pistons here.
It's funny, isn't it?
And that's not the smallest Honda piston.
No,
we've got D-Series
dome.
guys that go down another, almost 10 millimeters?
Yeah. And you have to have, because of the valve angles and how the chamber is shaped, you have to have a pretty significant dome to get the compression ratio up.
Right.
So it's not, when you get into those more exotic cylinder heads that have the valve face angle turned, like, see how the valve relief is like this? Turn the valve like this, chamber gets smaller, piston gets flatter, better flame propagation, you know, just nicer engine.
Yeah.
But this is what it is, man. It's gonna be cool.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So one thing that's different on an inline engine than engine that two rods are sharing a common pin, do you see how this side of the rod is flat?
Okay.
And this side of the rod has a chamfer.
Right.
So if you look at the crankshaft, a chamfer and a flat. So these rods, when they're in the engine, you're going to have rods that are like this, where the flats are against the flats and the chamfers are against the crank.
Right.
If you install the rod backwards, now you're going to have the chamfer against the chamfer. And because these aftermarket crankshafts have these long radiuses to try to add strength between the throw and the rest of the crank, it won't turn, or you won't have any side rod clearance. Hopefully it won't turn, and then you catch it right there.
Just fix it while it's still
Yeah,
apart.
but if you miss it, you're gonna be in a world of hurt.
Right. No.
Push down with. Oh, Pablo with the man hands. Dang.
What do you think this is?
I mean, you did way better than the last guy.
Well,
That was impressive, Pablo.
thanks.
Here, listen, for future reference, that was number 2. If it leaves the chat, we got to talk about Pablo. I looked at the order date on those pistons today. It was 2018. That's sad.
Long time coming.
Yeah. No wonder my wife talks about this project the way she talks about it.
I like that technique, sweeping it over a razor blade.
Yeah, you don't want to drag the support rail across the face of the piston. The support rails have a lot of tension. So sliding it down that razor blade, it's a pain-free, scratch-free way to do it.
Right.
Now, I say pain-free, like if you cannot manage a razor blade, you should not be using them. If you cut your finger using a razor blade during this part of the game, you maybe shouldn't be using razor blades. You know, you have this locating dot that needs to be in the pin boss.
Oh, wow.
And that's what's going to locate that.
Okay.
Right? And then you get it, kind of wrestled around the piston. And then just as you bring it down near the ringland, put it on top of the razor blade.
Right.
And then bring the razor blade to the end of the oil ringland and then just slide it in.
That's an extremely strong support rail. How long have you had this Mustang that you're working on now?
Well, the car itself came into my life in around 01 or 02. And I was working for another guy, and this guy, John O'Brien, who owned the car before me, he scheduled an appointment to come meet with us about building this car to race. And the fellow that I was working for came back to the bay and said, "Some dude's up front, I don't want to deal with him, like, can you go deal with him?" And I said, "Yeah, man." And that gave way to building this car. And it was really a neat exercise, and I got to learn a ton because I got to get out of my box and start to see what people around the country were doing while John and I were wandering around racing this car. And met a lot of lifelong friends. But within a few years, that gave way to quitting that job and starting Real Street Performance.
Wow.
So the Real Street Performance is without this car, my whole life trajectory changes, which is...
That's crazy when you think about it.
Yeah, it is.
A car.
A car. So, it's cool because everybody has a car in their life.
Right.
And that car may have brought relationships or friends or racing or memories or whatever. But for me, this car is that car.
Right.
John raced it, and then John's life changed, and he wanted to pursue different career opportunities and grow his career and with his family and whatnot. So he said, he kind of passed it to me. So he filed all the original paperwork for Real Street to start. Filed our LLC, His mom actually did some of the early bookkeeping for us.
Wow.
And then he sold me the car for some nominal dumb amount, like, you know, didn't even matter what it was.
Right.
And then the company started, and I couldn't use my last name because it's Meager. So imagine all the jokes if it were Meager Performance, right? Like, it's never ending. So we just took Real Street because Real Street was the class that the car was raced in.
Okay.
It was an NMRA class, but a lot of really, really neat people and really neat relationships were born out of this one particular car. Yeah, it's crazy.
Who would have thought that looking back at it?
Oh, I know. It's mind blowing. You know, it's really a good testament to how much what some people may view as a hobby that doesn't make any sense, that's extremely expensive, and you do all this stuff to play for a very short period of time, you know, comparatively.
Right.
And but to the guys that are in it,
It's everything.
it's everything.
It's your whole life.
Yeah. So it's like when you see a guy that crashes a car that's been in his life forever, and some people may not understand what that guy's going through. It's like, well, yeah, because from that one piece of metal and money was stemmed all of these incredible relationships that you may have for the rest of your life. Like, I have lifelong relationships out of this car.
Right.
It's really cool. That's why this car took this turn in becoming naturally aspirated, because as I age, I need to have a car. I need this car to be a car that I can just enjoy on a whim, and I don't need to pour a tremendous amount of effort into it to keep it happy. You know, it's going to be a car that, you know, if I want to beat around in it, I can beat around in it. It's not extreme. It's not going to be what it once was.
Doesn't have to be max effort. You just
Doesn't
gotta
need to be
enjoy
max
it.
effort. It's just going to be a toy. Yeah. See how the bearing's offset in the rod? Mm-hmm.
It's over to this side.
Same chamfer game we were talking about before. Another thing you can do when you're putting together a V8 engine is move the deck to where it's kind of horizontal. Mm-hmm. That way when you hang the rod down, you don't have to worry about the rod bouncing off of things. Like in the old days, there were these little booties you'd put on the rod bolts.
Oh, like little vacuum nipples.
Yeah. But
covers.
aftermarket rods, you know, they're using not a stud nut configuration, just a bolt, so you don't really have that. arguably the worst thing about engines like these is the valve train system.
Yeah, and the lifters are known to fail on these types of engines.
Well, this is a solid roller.
Okay.
So factory, it had a hydraulic flat tappet or a hydraulic roller, depending on the year of the engine.
Okay.
Then they go to solid roller, and they had needle bearings in here. So these were a needle bearing system.
Now it's like a ball bearing?
It's a bushing.
Oh.
This is a nice lifter. These are Iscadarian, and they have a pressurized bushing. So oil is going to be in there lubricating the bushing. But the early ones, and a lot of them, are needle bearing. And what happens is the needle bearing gets staked from the roller stopping at low speeds or valve float. And then when that lifter breaks, everything just goes in the engine. And it just makes a horrific mess. So it's one of the worst things about these engines is getting the valve train really sorted. It's not like, for us in the import world, we don't have to like do a lot of crazy stuff to get a sorted valve train. It's just, we got it easy, we got it easy. We just don't know how easy we got it because it's always been easy. See that? That's 2 valves.
It's a big valve.
That's all it's got, man. So one of the things we did is we put another oil drain back hole. So that hole is not there natively.
Where does it end up draining to?
It's gonna have an external line that goes down to the pan.
Oh, okay.
So I've got some really nice fittings from Brown & Miller, and we're gonna just run external drain back lines back to the pan to try to get, it's a wet sump, try to get all the, keep as much oil down as you can. And you actually restrict some of the oil going to the top of the engine through, down in these 2 holes, there's restrictor jets. So because the lifters are solid, they don't need as much oil as you would in a hydraulic system. So we limit oil, increase drain back. All of these holes are aftermarket holes to try to really increase drain back to get it not, because like what the way that it was done before is there were these, see how this is kind of ported and smoothed out? Before there was just a screen mudded in there, and the thought was like if something breaks, it gets stuck in the screen. Well, they had put so much glue involved that the screen just became kind of a drain plug, and then the oil can't get back into the bottom of the engine. Another thing that was done on this block that wasn't done at Dart is the countersunk thread.
Okay.
So before, the threads would just come right to the deck. And when you tighten the hardware up, it pulls that material up around the fastener. Okay. And now you've got a head gasket problem you didn't want. So this chamfering or a countersink is, it's kind of both, but that's to get the threads down from the deck. And as engines aged, things got better. You'll notice most modern engines, the threads to the cylinder head are down the cylinder. That's to try to change the deflection. And the other thing is these bolt holes are blind. The factory ones go into coolant.
Really?
Yeah. One of the worst things about these engines was the 4 bolts per cylinder. So the Chevrolet engine had 5 bolts per cylinder, as they kind of went back and forth through the, 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever. Okay. But the small block Ford had just 4 bolts, so they had head gasket problems that the other engine, But then the Chevys had different problems because of the way the ports were configured and where the heads would break. It's definitely an imperfect world when it comes to these old engines. Now this is a little cumbersome. These engines had a pedestal mount rocker arm stock, and this is a shaft system. But there's these shims that you put under the shaft bracket in order to try to correct the valve chain geometry. So it's kind of...
Seems like a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. But when it's right, it's as right as it can get. When you get the push rod length right, you basically want the tip of the rocker to be traveling over the face of the valve without pushing the face of the valve away as the rocker opens. So if you have the rocker geometry wrong, you create a situation where you're going to have abnormal guide wear.
Okay.
So you want to be pushing the valve open and not pushing the valve away as it opens. So there's basically like the rocker's going to travel across, the roller's going to travel across the face of the valve. It's a roller rocker.
Okay.
The factory rockers were not roller rockers. They just have like a slide on them, like a heel. But once it's all right, you will have the least amount of travel across the face of the valve, which then you'll have the best wear. But you could also optimize lift and things like that through valve chain geometry. So this was a part that plagued the small block Ford for a long time, oil pump drive shaft. And the factory one looks like this. It's just a hex.
Okay. All the way through?
All the way through.
Okay.
So if anything, if a piece of the pan gasket or a pan gasket dowel, they used to have these quart gaskets with these little pins in them, valve covers, they would get into the pump and lock it up. Then you just wouldn't have oil pressure. So ARP and a few other manufacturers made a heavy duty pump shaft. But if the pump shaft breaks, the cam is driven off. The cam drives the distributor, so the engine would just keep running. So if the user didn't know, you could make a real mess.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, it was just 60s.
Is that an OE replacement, like Ford made oil
Yeah, this
pump?
is a factory Ford. They're still available. There's a lot of, unlike the import community, there's a lot of aftermarket oil pump options. So you can buy a high volume pump, high pressure pump. There's pumps with reduced gear section. So if you want a low volume pump, this car for a long time had a low volume pump because I didn't, I could pick up a little bit of horsepower with less oil pump. And it didn't hurt bearings. It would only make like 45 or 50 PSI of oil pressure, 8,000 RPM. But it wasn't making much power, you know, so it never really mattered.
So for now, this setup, you're okay with an oil pump that's OEM?
Oh yeah, yeah. I took it apart and made sure that it wasn't, it didn't have any burrs or anything in it, and just put it on the engine. There's blueprinted, you know, today you can buy probably 10 different oil pump options for this engine. So they're well supported.
Wow. really like these stacks you got going on.
Yeah, this is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
This stuff is, my buddy Joe hooked me up with this stuff. This is his first setup that he had that made over 650 wheel. But
Wow.
a lot of this stuff I couldn't, I just couldn't justify buying it. It's just a lot of money. But when he upgraded, he was going to replace it anyway, so he kind of passed it to a friend.
Right.
And then JTO Power had already made the throttle brackets for the drive-by-wire motors. Because one of the main obstacles in a system like this is you've got to be able to actuate each bank exactly the same, or you have some tuning nightmares. So each bank has its own drive-by-wire motor. Each bank has its own bank position sensor, or GPS. So you can get good bank balance. And there's cars that struggle with that.
Is it difficult to get the V8 stuff to match?
Yeah, like if you go into like the M5s, the V10 M5s and the V8 M3s, they use like a large idle control motor to drive around at low speed and leave the throttle banks closed.
Wow.
Because when you start to crank one of those banks open, like a lot of airflow happens and a very small amount of throttle angle change, and it's just not exactly fun to manage.
Do these not have the ability to just link each bank to the other bank?
Sure, but then they were a little concerned that one drive-by-wire motor wouldn't be able to have the torque to close the throttle all the time.
Makes sense. Yeah. I've always wanted to do ITBs on something.
Yeah, the sound is amazing.
Yeah. Like on the B series stuff, it's cheap enough that you can do it, but it faces the firewall, and that's not fun.
Yeah.
And then the K series stuff, they're just a little more expensive than doing other stuff. So
if I ever felt so inclined to build an aspirated K series Civic, it would have to have stacks.
Absolutely.
The sound is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Those all motor, like one of the coolest things about going to Maryland is watching all motor. Those guys are just, they have incredibly awesome sounding engines.
Yeah, they do.
Both V8 and import. Can I make engine noises?
Go ahead.
Vroom, 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 vroom. Oh, doing a burnout.
So all these brackets look pretty neat, but they don't look OEM. These aftermarket pulleys, or?
Yeah, this is me going a little too far.
What do you mean?
Well, because the headers, in order to get the headers to where the ground clearance is good enough, because the car's low, the engine mounts had to come off the engine, which meant motor plate.
Okay.
Well, a motor plate to go in the car that you unbolt in and out, then the paint blows off around the motor plate. So JTO Power did these brackets, which bolt to the factory sway bar brackets, and they lay in bare stainless. So no matter how many times you take the engine in and out of the car, you never touch paint.
Wow.
Which is pretty cool. And then all this accessory drives, you have a vacuum pump to suck on the crankcase. So the crankcase is always in vacuum. So the rings are in a more stable environment, makes more high RPM power. And all of these components, all these drive components are from the Jones brothers, this Jones Racing. So Chad and Chris, they have like a lot of accessory drive packages for different engines. So they're not very big in the import community yet, but the drifters are using them, and it's like really awesome stuff. So it just, instead of finding and using 20-year-old beat down, beat up accessory drive, and then having to find a solution to get the air pump mounted, I just went ahead and got the Jones stuff because it'll all be uniform.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is like a Stewart Stage 4 water pump.
What's the stage referred to?
Impeller size.
Okay.
So this water pump is like actual NASCAR tech that you can get in a domestic package like this. So it's pretty cool. And the alternator came from Jones, and it's just a 1-wire. So the wiring's very simplified.
Yeah.
It's nice stuff. It's like it's just one of those things where you're like, okay, I'm just gonna do it right. So you just buy their stuff, and it's all good. And they can make you just about anything. They've been very helpful with the land speed stuff, because they've made us custom drive systems for dry sumps and water pumps and things like that. They're really neat dudes to deal with.
Nice.
Yeah.
Whoa!
Vroom, vroom.
That looks good now.
Yeah.
Vroom. Nice.
It doesn't make that noise.
That's what Instagram says.
I hope you've enjoyed this video. This is a pretty awesome engine. Again, 381 inches, small block Ford, stacked injection, all the goodies, really, really nice piece. Really takes me back to what was going on in my life when I started Real Street, and for all these years later to be able to still have the same toys in my life and be excited about playing with them, and being excited about sharing that stuff with the younger generation that had never really messed with push rods before. It's been a neat experience. So is there anything about this engine that really sticks out in your mind?
You hit the nail on the head with that push rod stuff. I mean, like you said, I've never really worked with this type of platform before, and it's cool to see the old technology with newer parts still being as cool as it would have been if you're building an overhead cam engine.
Yeah.
So it's pretty neat. I look forward to seeing what this thing does, and hopefully we see this thing rip soon.
Yeah. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. We'll catch you next time.